Imagine standing in the dock accused of a serious crime, not murder, not rape, not manslaughter, but something that could still end with you losing your liberty for years, a violent assault, a serious fraud, possession of indecent images, public order offence after a heated protest. Now imagine looking up and realising there's no jury, no 12 faces, no cross section of your fellow citizens, just one person, one judge, and mind that. One, mind. And that, if David Lammy gets his way, will be the new normal for most serious criminal cases in England and Wales. That is the scale of what's being proposed. Under the plan floated in this confidential memorandum, juries would be reserved for a narrow band of offences: murder, rape, manslaughter, and a thin, undefined slice of public interest cases. Everything else that might attract up to 5 years in prison would be decided by a judge sitting alone. We're not talking about a marginal tweak. The expectation in the briefing is that around three-quarters of trials now heard by juries would move into this judge-only world. Alongside that, magistrates would see their sentencing powers extended from 12 months to 24, dragging yet more cases away from the Crown Court altogether. The rationale, of course, is dressed in the language of crisis. There are about 78,000 cases backed up in the Crown Court list, and some victims are being given trial dates in 2029. Lives are on hold, evidence decays, people walk away, no one serious denies that this is intolerable. It's easy for a minister to say justice delayed is justice denied, and then offer the scheme as bold necessary surgery. And in a strictly bureaucratic sense, Lammy is right that there is no absolute codified right to a jury trial for every offence. One formal right is to a fair trial, not to 12 citizens in a box as such. But listen carefully to the move that is being made here. A constitutional practice that has anchored our criminal justice system for 8 centuries is being reduced to a technicality. Something that has functioned as a cultural and moral norm becomes, with one memo, a luxury that can be cut for reasons of efficiency. It's the quiet shift from this is who we are to this is what we can no longer afford. Historically, trial by jury is not a sentimental ornament. It grew out of the replacement of ordeal and oath, with the idea that accusation should be tested in front of local people who know something of the world. By the time of Magna Carta, the notion that a free person should not be punished except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land had become quite literally the watchword of English liberty. Ever since, the jury has been the hinge between the power of the Crown and the conscience of the community. You take that hinge away, and you don't simply speed things up, you alter the nature of the door. Pour more serious crime into a judge-only system and several dangers arise at once in that liminal moment. You have entered a new world. The first is the concentration of power. Instead of decisions about guilt being made by 12 lay citizens, they are made by a small cadre of professionals drawn from a fairly narrow social and educational band living inside a particular institutional culture. No matter how conscientious individual judges are, they're not immune to the climate of politics, the preferences of the senior judiciary, the pressures of the Home Office, the fashions of the commentariat. A jury can sometimes blunt those things, a single judge cannot. We don't have enough judges. One of the reasons that law takes so long is that our judges are in short supply. Getting rid of the juries is not by itself going to speed up this process because we don't have enough judges to replace all the jury trials that are being abolished. The second is the perception of bias. We already live in a time of suspicion about two-tier justice. Protesters jailed while more serious offenders walk. Online speech punished more heavily than physical violence. Bail and sentencing guidance that seems to treat some groups more leniently than others. Against that background, imagine telling the public that when it comes to contested cases about race, protest, immigration, sex, public order, speech, fraud and corruption, they no longer get any say. No ordinary men and women in the box, no community conscience, just a professional elite assuring us that everything is fair. That might be administratively neat, politically it's explosive. And the third is the loss of lay common sense. Juries are often clumsy and unpredictable. That's precisely their virtue. They are made up of people who are not steeped in legal jargon or ideological fashion. They bring the stubborn reality of ordinary life into the courtroom. They can see when a law has been applied in a technically correct but morally absurd way. They can see when the prosecution may be formally adequate but substantively vindictive. They can see when a complainant is plainly unreliable, even though their evidence ticks all the boxes on a checklist. They can sometimes act quietly as a safety valve when Parliament has overreached. What makes this proposal particularly audacious is that David Lammy knows all of this. In his own review of race in the criminal justice system, he celebrated juries as a success story, precisely because they level out bias. He'd previously called criminal trials without juries a bad idea, yet now, from the Lord Chancellor's office, he's writing to colleagues to insist that there is no right to a jury and that wholesale replacement of juries with judges will not compromise fairness. The transformation from defender of lay justice to constitutional butcher has been remarkably swift. Nor is it credible to pretend that juries are the villain of the backlog. The system is jammed up because for more than a decade, governments of all colours have starved it of money, closed courtrooms, capped sitting days. They've failed to recruit enough judges and advocates and allow buildings and basic systems to decay. Trials collapse because the police and the CPS cannot manage disclosure, because witnesses are not warned properly, because there is no prosecutor available, because the heating's failed, because the roof leaks. In those moments, the problem isn't 12 people sitting listening quietly in the box. The problem is the state that has chosen year after year not to fund the machinery of justice. That is why the Criminal Bar, the Law Society, senior KCs and many judges are pushing back so hard. They can smell the shortcut. Instead of doing the boring, expensive work of repairing the system, ministers have reached for the constitutional crowbar. Rather than pay for more sitting days, they talk about reform. Rather than build an honest public case for an inquisitional model with robust safeguards, they'll slide us towards something that looks suspiciously like a star chamber justice, serious matters decided by professionals, out of reach of lay citizens with public interest acting only as a vague escape hatch for a few symbolic jury trials to reassure the newspapers. Of course the backlog has to be dealt with. There's no virtue in victims waiting 4 years to give evidence in a rape trial, or defendants living half a decade with a charge hanging over them, but there are other paths. One could properly fund courts, reopen dark courtrooms, authorise more sitting days, pay enough to retain experienced advocates. One could implement the more modest elements of Leveson's proposals, a genuinely intermediate court where a judge sits with 2 lay magistrates on tightly defined categories of mid-level cases, evaluated over time instead of rolled out as a fait accompli. One could reserve judge-only trials for truly exceptional circumstances, blatant jury intimidation or massively complex international fraud, not for everyday serious crime. One could, for example, wash away all those trials of people who have blown whistles in the NHS and say, you know, this is just bad. We shouldn't be taking these people to court simply for doing their job. If ministers still insisted on emergency measures, they could at least have the humility to build in a sunset clause, a hard expiry date with automatic return to full jury trial unless Parliament, after independent review, explicitly consents to continue. The fact that such caution is not front and centre tells you something important. Once governments discover that they can erase capacity constraints simply by removing the public from the process, the temptation to do it again and again will be stronger. That is why this proposal makes me uneasy. Not because I am particularly sorry to see the jury disappear. I am, of course. In fact, at the moment, when I'm not talking on YouTube or teaching, I'm busy constructing an animated film that I hope will develop of W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan's first serious collaboration, Trial by Jury, which is a tremendous hoot and is based on a jury trial that would be out of the question under Lammy's new directive. And I hope it will see the light of day, and I hope I'll be able to share it with you. But there is a world of difference between adjusting procedure and amputating principle. Jury trial in serious criminal matters is not a quaint relic. It is one of the very few remaining points in which the ordinary citizen exercises direct power over the state. If we retreat to a world in which almost all serious accusations are tried by judges alone, assuming we can actually find enough and pay enough, we move closer to a system where law is something done to the public, not something done by the public, and we should be honest about the trade on offer. To clear a backlog produced by political choices, the government now proposes to hollow out one of the few structures that has, for centuries, defended the citizen against political overreach. It is not bold in any admirable way. It is short-term, short-sighted, and constitutionally reckless. If this scheme goes through, future law students will read about the early 21st century as the moment when Britain quietly redefined what justice meant. From judgment by one's peers to judgment by one's betters. And the question, as ever, is not just whether that is efficient, it is whether we are prepared to accept it.